Thanks very much. First, let me just say that I rewrote my entire talk while I was on the S-Bahn over here. So there may be some confusion and incoherence. Please forgive me as I try to piece it all together. Well, first of all, an admission to everybody, though I view Bobby Worth as a kindred spirit. I've actually never met him face-to-face until about an hour and a half ago, which is odd because both of us have reported from the Middle East for the same publications, including the New York Times Magazine and the New York Review of Books. We both have an abiding interest in the history, the culture, and the conflicts of the developing world. We've exchanged Facebook messages about on-the-road logistics and about each other's work, but somehow until tonight, we've never actually crossed paths. However, I've wanted to make his acquaintance for years because I do truly regard him as a journalistic inspiration. I began reading Bobby's byline from Baghdad in the early 2000s, during the period of the American invasion and the insurgency. I continued reading it when he was reporting from Beirut and the Middle East, but my admiration for his work really peaked when he went to the New York to become a staff writer at the New York Times Magazine, I believe in 2011, very fortuitously at the beginning of the Arab Spring. Basically, the editors of the Times Magazine let Robert Worth be Robert Worth, and with huge amount of space and the freedom to do what he wanted to do. And he, in my mind, he became one of the great practitioners of narrative nonfiction, or as we like to say in this profession, long-form journalism. I remember vividly the first long-form piece of his I saw in July 2011. The Times published his piece, Yemen on the Brink of Hell. Everybody else at that time seemed to be running off to Libya or to Egypt to cover the revolutions there. Instead, Bobby turned his attention to this backwater at the bottom of the Arabian Peninsula, and he drew an indelible portrait of a medieval tribal society quaking before a populist revolt. In rapid succession came lengthy narratives from post-Mubarak Egypt and post-Qaddafi Libya, tales of hope and violence filled with vivid characters. He wrote about a progressive young Muslim Brotherhood legislator trying and failing to bridge the divide between Islamists and secular Democrats. He chronicled Libya's disintegration into militia-run fiefdoms and the savage dispensation of justice against Qaddafi's loyalists. In one chilling case, he introduced us to a militiaman, the brother of a murdered doctor, who had basically taken total control over his brother's murderer. Somehow, Worth pulled off the amazing feat of making us feel the moral dilemma of this brother, militiaman, while also humanizing the killer. Then in April 2016 came, I believe it was April, came the culmination, because that's the month my book came out, right? We came out at the same time. Came the culmination of all that excellent work in A Rage to Order, the Middle East in Turmoil from Tahrir Square to ISIS. The book completes the story that Worth began to tell in late 2011 and 2012 as the hopes of the Arab Spring flickered out, replaced by more dictatorship, bloodshed, and Islamist terror. Fareed Zakaria said A Rage to Order was, quote, not simply the best book on the Arab Spring, it is the best book on the Arab world today. Roger Cohen called it a beautifully written chronicle told through the struggles of ordinary people, of shattered hopes, lives, families, and societies. Worth does not judge, he reveals. I would second that judgment, but I would also say that behind the objective revelation lies a very strong moral voice, a sense of humanity and empathy. That's what the best foreign correspondents have going for them, and Robert Worth is definitely, in my mind, at the top of the pack. Brief biography. He was born and raised in Manhattan, graduated from Wesleyan, tell me if I get this right, and got a PhD in English from Princeton University. Good choice, my alma mater. He joined the New York Times Metro Desk in 2000, then served as a correspondent in Baghdad and Beirut before coming to the Times Magazine. He's also been a contributor to the New York Review of Books and a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, where he worked on A Rage to Order. He's married to Alice Clapman, a lawyer for the American Civil Liberties Union, and they have a son, Isaac, born in 2007, lives in Washington. So with that, no further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you my esteemed colleague, Robert Worth.
Thank you very much, Josh, for that kind introduction. It's a real pleasure for me to be here at the American Academy, and my first visit ever to Berlin. It's a privilege. I want to begin by talking about how I came to write this book, because the chronology is very difficult to separate from the subject matter. In the spring of 2011, as I was following the progress of the Arab uprisings and writing about them for the Times Magazine, it occurred to me that I would eventually want to write a book about them. This was basically a matter of gut feeling. The events felt incredibly important, even more so than the invasion of Iraq in 2003 felt. And they were incredibly moving. They seemed, if only for a little while, to rip up all my cynical assumptions about the Arab world and to make something entirely new seem possible. But what kind of book? The literary question, how to shape a narrative about these events, emerged very quickly with the political one. What were the Arab uprisings? Were they a single region-wide event or a series of loosely connected revolts? Was it a movement for democracy or the collapse of a regional order? Was it the beginning of something or the end of something? The answer shifted over time, and it continues to shift. And this has been one of the fascinating things about writing about the uprisings. Social upheavals, I'm sure this is true of them all, create a kind of kaleidoscope effect so that it changes the way we see the recent past. My first instinct was to focus on a single country because the uprisings seem to be playing out so differently in each country. And I chose to write about Yemen. The fact that there was an uprising at all in Yemen surprised a lot of people, Arabs particularly, because it didn't fit the pattern. The early uprisings took place in Tunisia and Egypt and were driven by young, telegenic, educated, middle-class students and people in their 20s. Yemen was the opposite. About 70% of Yemen's population lived outside of cities. It was tremendous. It was the poorest country in the Arab world. It was very, very tribal socially, very fragmented and violent. And internet penetration was and remains very, very low. But for those very reasons, the Yemeni uprisings were incredibly dramatic. Tribesmen whose whole lives have been organized around feuds dropped their weapons and even their traditional tribal gear, came into the protest encampment in the major cities, not just the capital, Sana'a, but other cities, and declared, and many of them signed long documents with hundreds of names on them, that they were giving up their feuds. They didn't care if they were killed. They would say to me, literally, I'm done with the tribal life. I want a civic life. That was just incredible to me. I'd spent years visiting Yemen as often as I could because to me it's often been seen sort of as a backwater of the Arab world, but it was a fascinating place to spend time. Very, very little known in the United States. And I had thought of these tribesmen as being immensely, and in some ways they were immensely proud of that tribal lifestyle. But many of them were saying, look, we're sick of this. We can't get an education. We can't do anything. We can't cross the line to the next province because someone's gonna kill me because of a feud that's not even my feud. It's my parents' feud, or my brother's feud, what have you. Not only that, these people, many rural Yemenis had a very, very traditional lifestyle. At night, they were home. They never really left their area or their village. And suddenly they were living in this huge, sprawling encampment in the middle of Sana'a. And encountering people they never would ordinarily have encountered. Taking classes at a makeshift university that was set up in one of the tents. A friend of mine put it this way. He said, new values are being formed. And I think it was true. And it was just tremendously exciting to see that happening. It was also, by the way, the longest. I mean, Egypt's uprising took 18 days, which seemed a long time if you were there the whole time, as I was. But Yemen's went on for 9 months. But as I prepared myself to write a book about Yemen and its uprising, I grew more and more baffled. I had thought that the uprising would provide a unifying narrative to a country that I had always found very difficult to understand in any kind of single way. I had thought before about writing a book about Yemen, but that was the trouble. You know, the South had been colonized by the British, had a very different history from the North. It was difficult to find a single personality who would take you through the entire country and its history. I thought I had this narrative, and then as time went on, Yemen's revolution seemed to collapse. Most of the protesters who made the revolution happen in the beginning went home and declared it to be a total failure. Ali Abdullah Saleh, the ruler and president, had stepped down in a deal that was brokered by the Gulf Cooperation Council and with the help of the United States ambassador. But he'd been replaced by his deputy. It didn't seem like a fundamental change at all. The ruling groups in the country went back to fighting each other in the same kind of way. The protests had not been just street theater, but what they really added up to was very hard to say. The events of 2011 seem to have enhanced this sense of centrifugal forces growing stronger, and that made it hard to tell a story about Yemen or any of these countries, not easier. The US government at the time was insisting that Yemen was a success story because Saleh had been replaced and there was an incremental step along the long march toward democracy. But outside the capital, where there was something called the national dialogue taking place, where all the parties would sort of get together and talk, that claim about the country seemed like a joke. The rebels, known as the Houthis up in the northwest, were marching southward across the country. Al-Qaeda had taken over a huge patch of the country in the south, and all these things only got worse. Also in the south, there was a secessionist movement that got worse and worse. And there was a similar fragmentation happening throughout the Arab world. Libya was probably the most striking example there. Again, I had actually also considered doing a book about Libya. Josh briefly referred to the militia I spent a lot of time with, who had been held in prison, had escaped at the beginning of the revolt, and then gone and captured the prison guards and put them in their own makeshift prison. I wanted to use that as kind of the foreground for a book about what was happening in Libya. But the same question arose: what was the largest narrative? It seemed to be falling apart as we watched. Many of the militia members I spent time with in Libya were optimistic in 2011 and 12. There were elections that took place in July 2012 that seemed to go well. And then no real government formed. Libya began to fragment into little pieces, and it's only continued to do so. So my book project was at a kind of impasse in the summer of 2013, and that is when the military overthrew Mohamed Morsi, the elected president. I went to Cairo and spent several weeks there that summer. And it was there that I first began to think that a book about all of the Arab uprisings might make sense. I divided my time between the Islamist uprising in Rabaa Square and the more secular precincts of Zamalek, which is where I was staying at a friend's place. And to go back and forth from those two places was to see two totally different realities in the same country. The Islamist rhetoric in Rabaa Square was really shocking and apocalyptic. But then you'd go home to Zamalek and, your old liberal friends who you'd always thought I was having the same kinds of views as at least that's the way I felt, as I did, were literally saying, we need to kill all those people, all of them. That's the only solution. To them, I think my position, human rights and so forth, you can't do that, was unrealistic, was naive, because to them, their society had gone through a kind of near-death experience, and any price was worth paying to restore order. I'd spent several weeks in Syria earlier that year, and the polarization I saw there seemed strangely similar to what I was seeing in Egypt. Everywhere, it seemed there was a kind of existential battle underway, and everything that the people had held sacred, the state above all, but also religion and one's clan, was in terrible danger. The liberals, who had been the public face of the 2011 uprisings, Wael Ghanem, maybe a name that rings a bell, the Google guy, as Obama called him, Ahmed Meher, and others, very appealing, young, smart, idealistic people, were either invisible or living in exile or utterly transformed into rabid partisans, just like everybody else. Whatever shelter the old Arab regimes had offered was gone, and everyone was now seeking to ally him or herself for the most uncompromising and powerful force anywhere. The rise of ISIS seemed to vindicate this narrative. ISIS spread very quickly to all 5 countries that I chose to write about. And ISIS marketed itself as a remedy for everything that was wrong with the Arabs. It was a world of complete and sort of eschatological certainty where paradise could be manifested on earth as long as people willed it with enough conviction. There was a strange kind of echo of the Tahrir square language, but in reverse. I think also that the disappointment that a lot of liberals felt, or not just liberals, anyone who had been there in Tahrir Square, was so intense, that sense of disillusion, that I think that made people more vulnerable to the propaganda of ISIS. So this was the premise for my book, or rather, I should say, the connective tissue, because the book is really a narrative book. It's not an analytical book. All I really needed to do was to provide these narratives with a unifying context, not a watertight historical thesis. I'm a journalist, not a historian. But I'd like briefly to go beyond the confines of my book and ask some questions to which I don't really have satisfying answers. First of all, why is it that the Arab states are simultaneously so strong and so weak? Their powers of surveillance and repression are notorious. This point really doesn't need illustration, but I'll just mention that one of my favorite examples actually comes from fiction, not from the things I've witnessed. There's a novel by Mahmoud Saeed called Saddam's City, set in Iraq during the 1980s. One of the characters is a military officer who is fully loyal to the regime, but like everybody else, he has moments of private rebellion. And one night he's making love with his wife, and he tells her in a moment of passion, "One of your pubic hairs is worth 1,000 Saddams." And of course, it turns out that they're recording everything, and they record that. And the next day he's brought in and tortured hideously and thrown in jail, and his career is over. This is not an unrealistic anecdote. But if the Arab states are terrifyingly strong in some ways, they're terribly weak in other ways. That is, they're lacking in popular legitimacy. So much so that they could be brought to their knees by a bunch of kids on Facebook. What happened in 2011, after all, was not so much a set of revolutions in the sense of, an act planned by a group of people with this clear ideology, I think, as the collapse of a group of states that have been rotting for decades. The corruption had gotten so bad, especially in Yemen and Syria, but in other Arab states as well, that the government had really been sort of hollowed out and had become a pretext for the perpetuation of kickback schemes. The process of government, in a way, just would get in the way of the process of just getting the money, bilking the money from the system. And as for the protesters, they really just got lucky, I think. They didn't have any real organizing ideas, no plans for a future state, no expertise in any of the required areas. There was a minor exception in Egypt where some people were better prepared than others, but still not enough. And I want to also briefly illustrate this story, not with fiction, but with a story from a friend of mine, a Polish friend who's in her 60s, who took part in the Solidarity movement in the 1980s. And in 2009, she began to travel around the Middle East, seeking out dissidents to talk to them. And she brought with her a stack of these old yellow Solidarity notebooks that they would pass around. They were used for, forming cells, telling people how to survive under torture, but also more ambitious stuff, outlining plans when the state collapsed, what to do next, where they were going to go, how to maintain order and discipline, all kinds of stuff. The Poles were really extraordinary in their, organization in those years. So she would meet these people and say, look, here's what we did. If it's useful, what can I do for you? And she found them catastrophically unprepared. They all wanted to be the next Václav Havel, but they had no patience for anything longer than a tweet. That was her phrase. And I have to say, I think it's mostly true. These people were, many of them, extraordinarily brave, admirable, principled, but not prepared. Even without looking to Poland, which admittedly is a very different society, and those kinds of comparisons are problematic, I realize, But there were reasons to be cautious about any revolution that came so easily. In the late 19th century, a Syrian intellectual named Abdurrahman al-Kawakibi wrote a book called The Characteristics of Despotism and the Struggle Against Enslavement. I actually only discovered this book after I'd finished mine. But it's an amazing book. In it, Kawakibi concludes that in order to truly fight despotism, two essential conditions must be met. First, he writes, despotism must not be fought with violence. It must be fought gradually and with gentleness. The second condition, he says, is that before fighting despotism, its replacement must be ready. The protesters of 2011 complied with Kawakibi's first condition early on, and they showed great courage in doing so. But their principled nonviolence gave way, inevitably, I think, under the pressure of horrifying state brutality, especially in Syria. As for the second condition, the need for a replacement, the protesters seemed to have one at first. They spoke of civic rights, of democracy, of reforms to bloated state bureaucracies, and an end to the pathology of police torture and religious radicalism. But these ideas were kind of store-bought. They were the same products we've been hearing about for years. No, I don't mean anything against them. I believe in them too. But there was no soil for those ideas to grow in. Outside of a fairly small elite, no one really knew what they meant. And the bigger point to me is that ultimately, I think, and sadly, the Arab world doesn't have the replacement Kawakibi was talking about. There's no viable alternative to the old authoritarian structure at this time, or at least not one that large numbers of people can buy into. Or rather, let me say it this way, there's only one alternative, and that is the Islamists. But their programs are deeply divisive and very poorly thought out. They really amount to slogans. Also, they had no leaders in 2011 with the charisma or the brains to pull it off. There was no Ayatollah Khamenei in the Sunni Arab world. The one exception is Rashid Ghannouchi in Tunisia, whom I'll get to later. But his country's small, and he recently declared himself to be post-Islamist. It's not clear how much his model can apply to the rest of the region. Some people pointed to another alternative model in 2011, Turkey. When you talk to rebels, in fact, in all these countries, and you would say, as many journalists did, what's the future? What do you want? They'd say, a namudaj Turkey, the Turkish model. But since then, Turkey has collapsed into intercommunal strife, autocracy, and repression. The past few months have made that very clear. It's one of those things I talked about with the kaleidoscope. To me, really, the past 10 years in Turkey seem different, to me anyway, in light of what's happened in the past 2 months. You have these two Islamist movements that worked concurrently, and once they began to collide, there was a terrible collapse, which has left much of the state empty chairs at this point. Everything I've been saying sounds, to anyone familiar with the Middle East, painfully familiar. This is where we were before 2011. Maybe a deeper question would be, why were the Arabs so unprepared for change? Why must it still come down to a battle between Islamists on the one hand and autocrats on the other? One traditional way to answer this question has been that Arab societies had not recovered from the damage inflicted by colonialism, which had set artificial borders and brought foreign ideologies onto a people still emerging from traditional lifestyles. Modern Arab political ideologies have all cast themselves as efforts to transcend this colonial artificiality, whether by building a more authentic Arab ethnic identity, as the Arab nationalism preached by Gamal Abdel Nasser in the 50s and 60s did, or by reclaiming a regional identity like Greater Syria or the Greater Maghreb and so forth, or by asserting a transnational Islamic identity in one form or another. All these ideas take for granted that the nation states carved out after World War I are a colonial imposition that betrayed a more indigenous order. But I think it's much too simple to blame it all on the European colonialists. First of all, most national borders are at least somewhat artificial. And in fact, Syria and Iraq were rough geographic terms that were 1,000 years old in poetry and literature. Also, the order imposed by colonial bureaucrats a century ago replaced another imperial order, centered in Istanbul. The Ottoman Empire ruled over the Arabs for 500 years and generated its own rebel movements. And before them, there was the Mamluks, who were also Turkic peoples who ruled in Cairo. There are some Arab historians who have made the case that the Arabs have not really ruled themselves for 1,000 years. And I don't know if they make this corollary, but it seems to make some sense to me that essentially the bad habits and resentments generated over all those centuries persisted after the Arabs really gained their independence in the decades after World War II. If this seems a bit far afield from 2011, let me explain. I had originally planned with this book to write a series of historical vignettes dating back centuries. I would intersperse the events of 2011 with stories from the 19th century, the 17th century, the 12th century, what have you. I decided in the end that this was a little too ambitious to take on, and it's probably a good thing. I can imagine sarcastic panel discussions at the Middle East Studies Association if I had tried to do this. One of those vignettes did survive in the book, and it's an account of an Alawite renegade who encountered an American missionary in Beirut in the 1860s. Let me just now step back a bit from these grand historical questions and remind you that my book doesn't really even try to answer them. It's a narrative account of what it is like to live through a profound social and political collapse. All the characters in my book had their lives upended by the uprisings of 2011, and I charted their progress up through 2015 in 5 countries. Some were ordinary people, some were not. Even with the political figures like Rashid Ghannouchi and Beji Caïda Sebsi, who were really the 2 figures in my Tunisia chapter. My goal was not just to tell that public history, but to show how their personal trajectories and family histories intersected with the public crises of the past 5 years. There's nothing polemical about the book, but polemics are a matter of perspective in the Middle East. It's impossible to write about it without incurring somebody's anger. I mean, for instance, the decision to make a central character out of Mohammed Boltegi, the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood leader, angered some of my more secular-minded Egyptian friends who wanted, his name to occur each time with the label terrorist in the front. I certainly don't make a hero out of him, but it's an attempt to make him into a human character, a very, very flawed one. Likewise, the chapter on Syria, which was published in earlier form in the Times Magazine, angered some of my Syrian opposition friends because its central figure was a young Alawite woman, and again, without defending her political ideals, it made her into a sympathetic character. It may also seem provocative to some people that this book contains almost no mention of the American role in the Middle East. I thought about writing a chapter on this subject, but for 2 reasons I chose not to. One, in a narrative book, I couldn't find a single American character who would take me through all these countries. I knew Chris Stevens, the American ambassador in Libya, who was killed in 2012, but his involvement was really just with that one country. But more broadly, I don't think the American role was very important in these uprisings. I think we tend to exaggerate the influence and the power of the United States in the Arab world. I think it's gotten smaller and smaller and smaller. I do think that the American invasion of Iraq and the decisions that followed from it, especially collapsing the Iraqi army and doing de-Baathification, had a huge effect on that country and a follow-on effect in the neighboring countries. But all the same, generally speaking, I think people tend to overstate that influence. Even in Libya, where the U.S. decision to support a NATO intervention obviously helped to get rid of Gaddafi, I think the result would probably have been quite similar, even if we hadn't done it. In Syria, there's a lot of talk that if Obama had been more aggressive early on, things might have gone differently. I tended to side with the people who advocated a slightly firmer American role, but I think that would have been a matter of saving lives, not a matter of changing the fundamental dynamics in that country. I think anything the United States would have tried to do could have been counteracted by Iran, which sees itself as having an existential stake in that battle, and the United States does not. I think, in fact, if the United States had handled Syria differently, that country could be in considerably worse shape than it is now. That's hard to believe, but there are deeper bottoms than one we see right now. So, in conclusion, if the Arab uprisings were about the collapse of the state, or rather, it certainly didn't collapse in all these countries, but if the profound weakening of the state, in other words, if they were about the end of something rather than the beginning of something, what can we say about what comes next? I'm going to give a couple of gestures that are very unsatisfying gestures in this direction. First, Tunisia. The situation there is very, very fragile still. Their economy is in a state of collapse. Their tourism industry is really dead. They still are in danger of more terrorist attacks, which could make the whole situation worse. But there are a few elements that really merit hope. One of them is that the Islamist movement there, or the post-Islamist movement now, is extremely sophisticated. I mean, it really almost can't be put in the same class as the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, because Ghannouchi, the leader of that movement, and I think he deserves enormous personal credit. He's not just the head of this movement. He brought this movement along. He's immensely flexible and very, very well educated about politics, and he was able to persuade his followers to step down, even though they had won freely and fairly in an election, and to agree to the rewrite, to make enormous concessions in the writing of a consensual constitution. I think if not for that, Tunisia would be in a much worse place than it is today. One of the major moguls in Tunisia is a guy who owns a TV station and who hates the Islamists with a passion. But he said to me, you know what? It wasn't Essebsi. The guy who saved the country was Rashid Ghannouchi. So coming from him, that really means something. Second, there's a shift towards decentralized government that I think could be promising. Many of the states in the Arab world are very over-centralized. It's partly, in some cases, a legacy of the French example, or French colonialism. But I think it's even apart from the fact that you had dictators in place, with just structurally, every decision coming from the center, it's a disaster. In the years before 2011, Bashar al-Assad in Syria had some advisors, and I know some of these people, who urged him to decentralize power in certain smaller respects, nothing major, and not for political reasons, for economic ones. They simply wanted, Aleppo and other cities to have the flexibility to make decisions about local contracts and stuff like this without everything flowing through the president. They thought it would help the economy to recover, and he, in principle, initially was for it, but then he said, no, look, what if one of these nice new mayors you're talking about turned out to be a Brotherhood supporter? Can't have that. Security is paramount. So there was no decentralization. In the wake of all that, there has been renewed discussion. In Tunisia, they're giving a lot more power to the provinces and to the cities. Yemen, before it fell into a state of total collapse and civil war, was talking about redividing the provinces and assigning more power locally. Again, it's sort of hard to say how promising this is when much of the region is in such a state of conflict. But eventually, I think that could be a promising direction. And then finally, and this is a very long-term way to think, but there are people who think that the family structure in the Arab world will have to change before there are real changes to politics. That there's a deep, deep paternalism that gets in the way. I mean, the sort of the cheap and dirty version of this is, you think Saddam was the problem? Each one of us is a Saddam. You heard that a lot in Iraq, but there's a certain kind of grain of truth in it. And one of my favorite rebels from 2011 was a guy named Ziad Alami, who was literally in this group that helped to plot the first protests in Tahrir Square. He's a wonderful guy. And the way he would put it to me was, we don't want any big men in Egypt anymore. We're tired of the big men in politics, the big men in religion, the big men in industry. It's always about big men, and we don't want that. The other people who talk this way, strangely enough, are Chinese business people in Egypt. There was a wonderful story in the New Yorker last year about Chinese business people in Egypt who run companies. One of them was trying to employ young women and found it impossible because when they're with their families, they face all kinds of constraints about propriety. And as soon as they get married, they're not allowed to leave the home. They just got to make babies. And so this guy was literally saying, that's the key. Forget about all these protests, all this street theater. It's meaningless. Once women are given a different role in society, you'll see everything change. And that's not an easy thing to change family structure. It's obviously not going to happen in the short term, but that may be another way in which we see change. Again, I offer these things up because I'd like to offer you some hope and not a uniformly grim picture of the future, which is what we tend to see when we read the newspapers these days. I'm going to leave it there, and I have some questions.
So you talked about the American role or the lack of, yeah. You talked about the American role or the lack of American role. There we go. I'm wondering what you think about Libya during the political campaign and before. We've heard so many attacks on President Obama and his 92% likely successor, Secretary of State Clinton, about how they screwed up the Libyan aftermath and allowed the chaos and tribalism and militia fiefdoms to take over the country. So how much blame do you think the Americans, first of all, how bad is Libya? Give us sort of a up-to-date assessment, if you can do that, on what the situation is there. Civil war, are they pumping oil, what's going on? And also, how much blame do the Americans get? Could anything have been done differently, or should anything have been done differently after Gaddafi was removed?
I think things could have been done differently, but not by the Americans. I think the Libyans had an opportunity, and many of my Libyan friends put it this way to me. At the end of 2011, they could have tried to disarm the militias. There were people who came forward and said, we need to do it now. Now is the only chance we have. But it would have been very difficult. They'd just been through a brutal, was a 9-month-long civil war. Nobody wanted to go back to war. But I think once that opportunity passed, they actually made the problem worse by starting to pay the militias. And I was there when the first militia payments were made. And these guys were joking to me. They were all waiting in these long lines to pick up their money. And they were saying, gosh, I didn't know there were this many people helping us out in the fight for free Libya, But once payday comes, everybody shows up. But of course, if you pay them, you give them another incentive to keep their weapons. And I think after that, it was just impossible. There wasn't enough, Libya's famous as the case of the country with no institutions left. Qaddafi gutted the place. And so I just don't think there was much America could have done. As for Benghazi, Chris Stevens was a really good diplomat, a smart guy who had been in Libya before 2011, who knew the country well. He was very up to date on what was going on in the country then. It so happens that he was wrong about the security situation that night, and he made a miscalculation and died. But to me, it was infuriating that people in Washington thought that they could somehow retrospectively say that they knew better than Chris Stevens. It was a tragedy what happened to him, but it was not a scandal in any way. I don't think, the State Department or Hillary Clinton has any share of blame in that. I think diplomacy has to be understood to be a risky but very important career and role. I think particularly now, one of the things that I find really troubling about that whole episode is that the United States had already withdrawn itself diplomatically. I mean, there's so many of these embassies in that region that are giant fortresses, and it's very hard for them to get out. Where I lived, Lebanon is one example. Even though the reasons for all that caution date back to the 1980s, but they haven't really changed the policy. So, when I wanted to meet with a diplomat there, which I rarely did, frankly, because they never got out. They didn't know the country very well. They would often ask you to go meet them in their fortress. Well, after Chris Stevens died, it all got much worse because the Obama administration, the last thing they wanted after this grilling over Benghazi was another diplomat to die. And I think that what that means is that the U.S. has less visibility in the Arab world at a time when they desperately need it. I think what we need is, a recognition. Number one, that diplomacy is a vital but risky, part of what we do. And secondly, that you're not going to have huge victories. You're not going to see diplomacy translate into a socialist paradise in any one of these countries, or maybe I should say capitalist paradise. That's what we prefer in the United States, right? Sorry, I'm in Germany. Sorry. But I think we have to settle for small victories and a greater ability in these countries to help, create mediation where it's possible. I mean, Yemen's a great example. In 2014 and 15, you had these two forces that were coming towards a clash: the Houthis and the remainder of the government, and they simply didn't have a figure who was trusted by both sides. I think the United States and other countries have to invest in the kind of diplomacy that allows you to build that kind of common ground that prevents conflicts. And if you're not there, there's nothing you can do. Yep.
Thank you very much for your talk. My name is Manfred Nitsch. I'm an emeritus professor of political economy at the Freie Universität. You said that you were here in Berlin for the first time. If somebody talks about Middle East in Berlin, a word should be said about the role Israel is playing in all that. You are in Berlin.
Well, I think Israel had very little to do with all of this, and I think it's, I have to be honest, I don't write about Israel, and I have very little sense of what their priorities are. I occasionally, run into Israeli officials and ask them. I think they were really uncertain what to think at first. I think there was a certain sense of relief that a conflict was occurring that had nothing to do with them. And it was interesting, you talked to some of the young people who were involved in making these revolts in 2011. And one of the many things that they wanted to throw out was the card played by Arab autocrats of, it's all because of Israel. They would use that to deflect attention from the way that they mistreated their people. And this tends to generate some resentment. So I think, to some extent, a truly indigenous movement that was about the conditions in those countries was overdue. And the fact that it had nothing to do with Israel was, as I say, something of a relief. But I think the Israelis were uncertain who they should root for, and particularly in Syria, which was the local conflict. Initially, I think they were excited about the prospect of something. This is what I was told, that they were excited about the prospect of getting rid of Bashar and having something better in his place. But the worse the jihadi problem got, and after all, you have to remember they had had a good relationship with Turkey, which quickly went south right before the Arab uprisings. And then they watched with deep unease as Turkey opened its borders and let anybody come through and created this sort of jihadi nightmare in Syria. And my understanding is at a certain point they said, look, we're better off with Bashar. The last thing we want is for him to collapse and to have jihadistan right on our border. And the last thing I've heard is that they favor, insofar as they have any influence over it, a sort of collection of minorities. The Kurdish state, they'd be happy to see that come true. That is to say, the Syrian Kurdish state, in addition to the Iraqi one that's pretty much already there. And perhaps an extended Assad-ruled Syria that includes the Christians, the Alawis, the Shiites. And I think they'd probably like to have Aleppo be part of that. That's an unsatisfying answer, but that's all I got.
I wanted to ask if you would perhaps engage in a bit of counterfactual speculation for us, and it's one for which you yourself opened the door. You said that if Obama had intervened, that there was a possibility that he may have potentially saved some lives, although he wouldn't have changed the situation in the long term. Watching television today, the talking point has basically become that if Obama had stuck to his red line, then we wouldn't have these problems in Syria like we do today. I wanted to ask you, what could he possibly have done? What sort of intervention could have taken place that you may have envisioned about saving someone's life? And what would the response of the Republican-controlled Congress have been had he intervened?
I think he had an opportunity in 2012 and maybe even 2013 to do some limited version of, a no-fly zone or a corridor. I don't honestly know how much difference it would have made, but if he had hampered Assad's air force at that time, he could have limited the bombing on civilian targets. To me, the big problem with American policy from the very beginning was that they said, okay, we're not for overthrowing Assad. Everybody knows that's a gamble that we're not willing to take. But they wanted to put enough pressure on him to force him to make a deal, to make a compromise. I believe that the Assad regime is utterly incapable of any kind of compromise. I believe they regard compromise as death. So I don't see what I don't see what Kerry's hoping for. I think, ultimately either Assad's going to survive or he's going to collapse. And if he collapses, it's going to be very, very messy. And I think Obama sensed that, but couldn't make up his mind about how to handle it. And I guess if I have a criticism of Obama in all of this, it's not so much that he should have done this or he should have done that, but that he should have made up his mind earlier. My guess is that he knew he didn't want to be in there, but he was being pressured to some extent by Samantha Power and other people who had an influence on him. And so he was reluctant to kind of fold his cards really early on and say, okay, I'm out. But recently I was in Paris talking to a friend who works for Hollande in the Élysée and who previously was in Washington at the embassy and whose brief is the Middle East. And he said, we understand it's too soon since Iraq for the United States to take that kind of risk. But, it's politically maybe impossible. But Obama should have told us. He said it would have made a huge difference if Obama had simply come to us in 2012 and said, I'm not going to do anything, nothing. Don't expect anything. It's not going to happen. He said, it's no guarantee, but at least if we'd known earlier, because after all, and I can tell you that that the French were not aware of that because this friend of mine was in Washington at the time and I used to see him all the time. He was constantly lobbying, constantly hoping that the United States would finally change its mind and get more involved. So he said, if we had known early on, we could have done something more. Now, how much the French would have done, I don't know. But they would have been armed with that knowledge.
Does this work? Yeah. Thank you so much for your talk. I was very interested in what you said about the structure of patriarchy and this question of, women. And I've just recently been reading Mona El-Tahawi. I don't know if you know the Egyptian feminist and this concept of, the Middle East needs a sexual revolution. So I was just wondering, in your opinion, which one of the countries in the region is more, closer to this sexual revolution, or what's the state of this, basically? Thank you.
I think Tunisia is probably a little bit closer into having some of, I don't know if a sexual revolution is the way to put it. And what's interesting, it doesn't fall neatly along ideological lines. Some of the women I've met who are most impressive in their careers, wear the headscarf and are Muslims. But so it's not simply a question of throwing that off, which tends to be the European approach. The place where you hear a lot of really, really strong-willed and serious feminism is in Kurdistan. And the reason for that, unfortunately, is somewhat unsavory. It's because Syrian Kurdistan and also the much of the southeast of Turkey, where the PKK is influential, their political philosophy is essentially a cult of Abdullah Öcalan, the founder of the PKK. And Öcalan decided a long time ago that equal rights for women was a foundational part of his doctrine. And they all march in lockstep in the PKK, so they all believe in it. Now, I don't like cults, but it is impressive to see women carrying guns and being engineers and getting exactly the same kind of education as men, which is the way they handle it in southeastern Turkey and now in Syria. It's an impressive thing. It's sort of hard to say whether that will survive. It's funny, there was an experiment, in a sense, in this kind of feminism in Yemen, in South Yemen, which, when the British left in 1967, quickly became this hardline Marxist state. And they imposed, the headscarf, the Islamic headscarf was banned. Women fought, women wore boots and marched around just like men, and women had the same education for a while as men. It was kind of a militant feminism, I guess, of a similar kind to the one that the Kurds have now. But it didn't get that deep. And so after the two Yemens merged, and it was no longer a Soviet client state and the Marxist ideology disappeared, traditional ways of life came back, and women no longer got those kinds of educations. And sadly, now one of the consequences of the war in Yemen, and really not just the war, but the collapse of any kind of authority in Yemen, is that there's a very, very conservative Salafi Islam is predominant there now, and Aden, the very place where women were marching around in boots and drinking beer, and not just everyone always says, oh, they wore miniskirts. Well, it's not just miniskirts. It's about getting PhDs. They have niqabs now, and they don't go out. Yeah.
From what I understand, what we are seeing is destabilizing forces at work, and I wonder where you expect stability to come from. Of course, we would prefer it to be secular democracy, a reform of the family system, a major role of women. But in the end, I would say it's exactly these destabilizing forces that we have to take into account when we are looking for stability. So you didn't mention so far, I guess, the religious divide between Sunni and Shiite. How will this...
I'm sorry, I missed the first thing you said. In which country?
I mean, in general, the divide between Sunni and Shiite, I think that's, in the end, a basic topic to deal with. And so far, I don't see any signs for a step to reconciliation. Of course, one can imagine new autocracies popping up who will solve the problem the usual way, applying force and favoring whichever faction they want to. It's the same with tribalism. I mean, you were talking about Yemen, I think, where people, obviously young people were fed up with tribalism, but it's the same. I don't see the end of tribalism. Of course, we would prefer a society without it, with more modern structures, but if we are not talking about long-term solutions, I would say in between, the solution has to come from exactly the conditions these regions suffer from, and that now work solely as destabilizing forces. Can you imagine them to work to bring stability coming from this religious divide being dealt with efficiently, and same with tribalism, family structures, women, men, and so on and so forth? Yeah.
With tribalism, I think largely that's more a matter of people whose society politically has collapsed, and who are just looking back towards anything for safety. It's a familial safety net that they can fall on. I think with the Sunni Shiite stuff, it's a little different because that's being actively promoted. And I think one of the terrible consequences of what happened in 2011 is that you had a real accentuation. I mean, it happened in 2004 and 5 and 6 as well in Iraq, but it's now across the whole region. It's being fueled by Saudi Arabia and by Iran. I think the Saudis feel deeply threatened and humiliated by Iran. They feel that the United States is no longer protecting them. They see the Iran deal, the nuclear deal, as a kind of a concession of Iranian influence over the region. They feel that the United States is just pulled back. And as a result, they feel that they have to assert themselves, unfortunately not always in ways that are ultimately good for them or the rest of the region. I mean, the obvious example is this war in Yemen. I was really struck that the day after, the war started in the spring of 2015, I saw a bunch of columns published in Arab newspapers. Of course, mostly Saudi-owned newspapers. Saudi Arabia owns much of the pan-Arab press. But they had real passion. I think they were not just the kinds of columns that were written because the Saudis expect them to be written. And the message was, thank God, we can be proud now. This is our message to Iran. We're going to fight. We're not just knuckling under. And it was an absurd message because they weren't fighting Iran. They were bombing the richest country in the region, was bombing the poorest country in the region without any real strategy. And the war over the past year and a half has been a catastrophe. They routinely hit hospitals and schools and wedding halls and kill a lot of people. They haven't defeated the Houthis. I don't see what the end game is. They're doing it because they feel so angry about Iran's incursions around the region, understandably, right? But Yemen is not the place to attack Iran. Yes, this group, the Houthis, has received support from Iran, but they're not creatures of Iran in the way that, for instance, Hezbollah is. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia has essentially given up in Lebanon because Hezbollah is so clearly the dominant force that's there. And I think the threat of militant, Salafi jihadis in northern Lebanon only accentuates the sense that Hezbollah is the only force that can protect the whole country from this. And so, we're probably now going to have a Christian president who's a sort of a puppet of Hezbollah in some sense in Lebanon. So as I said, there are reasons for the Saudis to feel challenged, but I think the sectarian narrative, which has become a kind of, a series of proxy wars around the region, just makes it all worse. The Saudis see Syria as a battleground in which they can't lose. The Iranians feel the same way. And it's one of the things that makes that war so intractable. In the back?
You seem to say that it would be mistaken to think about your story in terms of failed states or what the World Bank calls fragile or conflicted states. That these states actually can be quite durable, that they have particular types of competencies and capabilities, rather than seeing them as uniformly corrupt or weak. And moreover, you seem to infer that maybe we shouldn't be surprised that it might be a lot easier to get rid of autocrats, but to do a thorough house cleaning is a whole other story. So I guess my question is, in light of all of that, how do you think about both this durability question? How is that durability in some sense politically sustained? And what role, I guess, do foreign and imperial relations play in that role? I mean, all of that is a way of saying, in a sense, what's the type of time frame that you think about for any type of state building, given the type of history and stories that your book lays out?
Yeah. Let me answer that question with reference to Turkey. I think what happened in 2011, all these uprisings, Erdogan, the president of Turkey, looked at what was happening and said, this is my moment. His policy had been what they called no enemies. He wanted to be friends with everybody in the region. He thought this would just expand his own power because he thought the inevitable result of these uprisings would be new Islamist governments on the model of the Muslim Brotherhood all over the region. And he thought not only was this going to happen, but he might as well help make it happen. So he did, he tried, and Qatar did the same thing for different reasons. He was totally wrong. The pushback by the autocratic governments was much, much stronger than anybody could have thought. And I think that's partly because the Islamist project seems to be just a failed one, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I don't think they have slogans and they have immense street presence and credibility, but it doesn't translate into a workable government. So you had, Egypt's a good example, right? The Muslim Brotherhood was a very, very powerful and credible organization, but Morsi was a disaster. And I think people who had supported him turned around and said, we've got to defend the state. We may not like the people, we may not like Mubarak, we may not like Sisi, but we've got to defend the state. So I think that's part of what makes the autocrats so durable, is that the single alternative, the sort of grassroots movements were really Islamist in the region. And there was a widespread sense that that road leads nowhere. But I didn't really answer your question about how long it's going to take to build something different. And I hate to say this, but I don't really have an answer. I think it's going to be a long period of more of what we see now. I think if we can have local examples of something that's healthier, like Iraqi Kurdistan, that's great. I also think, the fact is that the monarchies have proved healthier than the republics. Morocco, I think, has more popular legitimacy. And it's not just that people have some, instinctive, I don't want to spread some stereotype that Arabs love kings, they're not sort of primitive somehow that way. It's partly just an absence of hypocrisy. If you set yourself up as a democratic republic, and then you behave just as bad, or actually in many cases much worse, than the kings, you're judged more harshly. And I think one of the problems republics had is that they were so new and so unstable that they were deeply vulnerable to corruption. You know, people came in and said, look, how long is this going to last? I'm going to grab my cash and go. But if you have a king in place and you know that his son's going to take his place, there's no rush.
Jordan, you go in that category too?
Yeah, it's its own kettle of fish, right? But it's at least better off than the other ones, I'd say. Yeah, sorry. In the back? Yeah.
It took the West 4 centuries to develop and institutionalize the notion of the sovereign state that endures because of its legitimacy among the people that are to be governed. And that concept, as we all know, has had many moving parts that played into it. But it took a very, very long time. And I wonder, you alluded to this, you've alluded to this several times, and I wonder if, or the extent to which you think that that is actually the sad thing that we are watching, is that it has taken centuries in other parts of the globe, and that may be what we may be seeing there.
Yeah, I mean, my short answer is yes. I think the people whose faces we saw in January and February of 2011, who were so appealing, while Ghanem and company had, what seemed to have a beautiful sense of what they wanted for these countries, but it was a sort of a shallow sense of what they wanted. You know, it was a Facebook understanding of the world, and I think what they wanted was to see this nice, orderly universe that they had witnessed during trips to other countries and read about online and stuff, to just pick it up and transplant it. But you can't do that. Google, at the time, Obama said, what do I want? I want the Google guy to run Egypt, but the Google guy had no experience in politics, and he wasn't representative of anything.
What is your view on Iran? Is it a threat to the Middle East as a whole? Is it a threat to the West, Western Europe, to the United States?
I don't think it's a fundamental threat. I think it's what's dangerous about it is that it's a pretty militant government that has the effect, and it has ever since 1979, of radicalizing all of the Sunni countries of the Middle East by making them feel just fundamentally challenged. I think this is one of the problems you have in the region is you have a series of crises that have terrified and humiliated people. The creation of Israel in 1948, the Six-Day War in 1967. It was largely, I think, it was as a result of those crises that many people felt we need a military government, we need a strong man, we need someone who's going to be really tough, forget about democracy. And that contributed to the creation of police states whose legacy we still have now. And so I think in the same way, 1979 in Iran and everything ever since has been this sort of bugbear for the rest of the region. I don't think Iran really wants to start a nuclear war or even necessarily have a nuclear weapon. It's a useful thing for them to threaten with. They love making grand gestures. They love saying death to America. I think they're ultimately more focused on rebuilding their economy, which, by the way, has not seemed to happen despite their doing the deal. And unless they can get European banks to lend them some money and make some deals, they may think differently about. Yeah. Oh, it's our fault. but I think a new if Hillary Clinton wins, I think that process may move forward. And I think I don't think the Obama administration was counting on a fundamentally new dynamic in Iran. I really think that it's true what they say, that they were frightened of a conflict between Israel. I mean, essentially, Obama was afraid that Bibi Netanyahu was going to bomb Iran, and that would have catastrophic effects across the region. That was what it was about. But I think they also hope that after Khamenei dies, you'll have a different era, maybe, and things will slowly change.
You mentioned various times that the vision for change in the area of for a democratic future is so shallow. That was, I think, your word. I'm wondering where are the intellectuals in those countries? Do they prefer to go to other countries, get out of the area, get out of all this chaos?
Yeah, I actually wrote a story in 2011 called "Where Are the Intellectuals in the Arab Revolts?" There's been a strange absence of them, you know, and in some cases, I think they unfairly were criticized for being cautious about them. I mean, for instance, the Syrian poet Adonis expressed real uneasiness about what was happening in Syria and around the region because he said it's sort of a mosque movement, and people pilloried him for that. I mean, he was sort of right. He happens to be an Alawi, which means people attribute everything he says to, you know, being somehow with the regime because of his sectarian identity. I think it was a little bit unfair. You know, but it wasn't. I mean, it's a movement that happened by accident, almost, and it didn't really have propagandists, and that way it's totally different from, you know, the Russian Revolution, say, or other revolutions where there was a strain of ideology leading up to it. This one just didn't have that, and I think it became chaotic so quickly that many intellectuals were understandably cautious about it. Yeah.
There's one country which hasn't been yet. This is Russia. What about the role of Russia? And it's a conflict maybe will not remain within these regions, or the many conflicts in this region, but that there might be a new Russian-American conflict coming up, where this starts at a regional, local level, but may spread at other places of the world. And my second question, the killing by drones. Does that mean that within the last 5 or 10 years in the international or American way, laws, judges, courts don't matter anymore because you have the power, you can people at every spot of the world, you just do it if you find it reasonable, and all the things which had been linked so far that there had be some kind of legal dispute if a person has to be killed, that this is just gone off and we'll do what we want to do?
The first question, Russia. I'm not a Russia expert. My sense is that Putin has no desire to create a major conflict with the U.S. in the Middle East. I don't think he's really ultimately interested in the Middle East. He's not going to get anything out of the Middle East. I mean, you know, they had this port in Banyas in Russia. He doesn't care about that. I think for Putin, Syria is useful because it's a way of creating leverage, which he can then spend in Ukraine, which he does care about. It's also just a great way to kind of put finger in the eye of the United States. And maybe most importantly, you know, this is a guy who has severe economic problems at home. And this is a great way to drum up support at home, to create a nationalist narrative, to you know, create a sense of a resurgent Russia when in fact the country is shrinking and, you know, in terrible economic straits. That's my sense of it. As for drones, it's not directly related to this, but I think there's a deep unease in the United States about how to constrain drones, because it's not just a question of the United States killing terrorists. You know, this is all technologies become democratized very quickly, and the same will happen with drones. So, you know, how are you going to create counter drone weapons? How are you going to regulate drones if that's at all possible? I think, you know, a lot of thought has been put into that lately. But yeah, I mean, Obama's policy essentially was pull back and kill terrorists on a selective basis. But even there, you know, just to draw a connection back to what I've been talking about, I think that the United States became deeply dependent on Saudi Arabia to get intelligence about whom to kill in Yemen among these terrorists. That was maybe one small part of the reason why the United States had to support the Saudi bombing campaign in Yemen. They've been doing us favors. We need to do them a favor. And by the way, the drone campaign in Yemen, you sometimes hear Yemenis complain and say, you know, it's an insult to our national sovereignty, and it's a human rights issue and so forth. Those things are true, and yet if you spend more time with the same Yemenis, hang out with them, shukat with them, talk to them, many of them will tell you, actually, I think it's kind of a good idea, this drone campaign. I mean, because they know that Al-Qaeda is a greater danger to them than it is to us. I mean, what they will tell you is, I mean, they get rightfully very, very angry when a drone hits a civilian. And I think they're also very right to say that it's preposterous that the United States doesn't apologize when that happens. And I still don't understand. There's some legal basis for this, but I have certain friends in the U.S. administration. I tell them this is crazy on a public relations basis. You know, you do something like that, go out and I know some of the people whose relatives were killed by drone strikes, and they're furious. Interestingly, some of them still tell me they support, in principle, having drones kill al-Qaeda figures. But when you go wrong, you acknowledge it. I mean, in the case that I know most about, once it was publicized through stories that I and other people wrote, they literally sent a paper bag full of cash to the relative of one of these people. And a member of the Yemeni intelligence service said, "Oh, here, this is for you," to the relative. And he said, "What do you mean? Who is this from?" And he essentially said, "Well, I'm not supposed to tell you it's from the United States government." And he said, "I'm not going to take that. Forget about it. That's insulting, you know." And he was right, I think. Now the family doesn't have that much money, and his cousin came the next day and took the money. But it's a preposterous policy. I mean, when you make a mistake, you apologize. Can we take one more question? Okay. One more question, and then our time is up. So,
I'm raising my arm on his behalf.
Yes. Please. Yeah.
Okay. Hello, good. Okay. I remember seeing two British Broadcasting Corporation polls of Syria, and one was done at the very beginning of the Civil War, and the other was done about 6 months ago. And the poll done at the beginning of the Civil War showed, it was a poll done in the entire country, and it showed that something like 57% of the respondents said they favored Assad. And then the poll done more recently was done only in the parts of the country controlled by Assad, and if I remember, the results were something like 65% say they supported Assad. Now, what do you think about the political constellation? Is this poll completely off, or is there a real possibility that the current regime has more supporters than opponents?
You know, first of all, polls in, war-torn police states are pretty hard to rely on, I think. But I do think that, at least half of the population supports him. Because, the rest of the country is in a state of bloodthirsty chaos. And many people who were living in opposition areas came to live in government areas, not necessarily, again, because they really support Assad, because at least they can live there safely. Sometimes those people are unfairly counted, by the way, by the government. As we'll see, they're living with us. Well, they're living with you because they don't want to get bombed. That's all. Still, they may well say they hate Assad, but at least it's better than ISIS. And that, unfortunately, has become the standard of comparison, and that's exactly what Bashar wanted, right? To create that as the only alternative. He's been successful in that, amazingly successful. It's sad. I mean, it's been a very cynical and single-minded policy that he's carried out from the very beginning. And I think one of the conundrums that's faced by not just the U.S. but the whole world is, what do you do about a government that is both, in many ways, it's tyrannical and weak, vulnerable to attack, and yet totally inflexible. not willing to compromise. And I don't have the answer. Okay.